In this epic fantasy tale, Karam is a princess with memories of her past life, embarking on an adventure in a world brimming with mystery and power. From the tragedy of her previous life as Savior丨Two to her reincarnated life in royalty, Karam's journey is filled with self-discovery and the challenges of destiny. From the tragedy of her past to the splendor of the royal court, Karam's story is one of self-exploration, strength, and choice. Dive into a universe where ancient legends intertwine with modern concepts, where the choices of every soul shape the future of the world. Join Karam on her journey to experience growth, love, and betrayal, a fantasy world you will never forget. Click to subscribe and begin your adventure. Prelude. Apart from being a child of the royal household, Karam shouldn't have been different than any other. Even so, certain circumstances have led her to be both abhorred and idolized. Her problems could all be chalked up to the thoughtless ramblings of a Japanese woman called Savior丨Two. While Ishii was alive, she had come to work as an assistant professor to a renowned genius of reincarnation. While she worked as a master in a similar field, her way of doing things differed slightly as compared to her professors. As a way of asking questions and finding answers, Ishii constantly questioned everything. Though it was not only due to this, but also due to her habit of saying everything on her mind that was her undoing. While she worked next to the professor, she questioned not only his work, but also him as a person. 4 years. She spoke again and again about his failings as a person and an educator. He felt his pride was being easily smashed, and that his life's work was being torn to shreds by this impudent woman. Eventually, he could hold back his grief no longer. He took her life into his own hands, though. As revenge for her nasty, uncaring words against his work, he used his knowledge to put her into a situation similar to his own, a life of reincarnation with memories of the life past. During his fit of passion, he had forgotten the reason he had kept her around in the first place. All this time, she spent her free time looking over his works and pointed out any holes, forgotten points and unconsidered possibilities. When he would refute, she would easily shake of his arguments without fail and bring up yet deeper reasons why his research was inadequate. Though it might seem a horrible thing to do, when he calmed down and considered all her points, a new angle could be seen. Each time, a new light could be seen and his research sped forward. After he realized this, he looked down at her dismantled body. He had reached the end of his research. He has finally found why his reincarnation was special in the first place. It had taken him his whole life, but he had finally found out why he was the way he was. For he had mulled over and despaired over this very thought. Yet when he had found the answer, he had used it on another human being. The man wept for what he had done to the girl. He wept about what it said about him. He wept not because her life was taken, but instead he wept for what it meant and for the way it was taken. For how could he have wished this upon somebody else? One might wonder what this had to do about Karam. If you have not yet figured it out yet, then I will explain. Though at this point it might be clear that Ishii and Karam are one and the same. For those of you out there who don't seem to quite grasp this, I will. Oh, I've already said it. Tasteless life. Karam, due to circumstances in her past life, was given several things that most would not otherwise be able to obtain. The first thing she obtained was power. Karam was born into the royal family. Though she was but the first son of the king, her place in society was looked upon with greater admiration than the king. This was due to the fact that her parents' marriage had ended a long war between the two nations, and they had finally become a single kingdom once again. Therefore, Karam and her parents were seen as the new hope for their land, while the ruler was a sign of the old kingdoms, and was looked upon with dissatisfaction, even though the people understood he was the one who had brought them peace. It was a futile fight. The king would never looked at with the admiration he should. It wasn't rare for this prince and princess to be treated like king and queen instead. The next thing, and possibly the most important, was not simply her memories that she had retained from her past life, but her ability to take what she learned in her past life and put it into action in this life. In other words, her brain was developed beyond her years. The third was due more to her heritage. Karam had also obtained beauty in this world. In the prince's old kingdom especially. Strength was valued above all else therefore. It was a given that the royals were fit and healthy. Also, there was no inbreeding because it wasn't lineage that was treasured. To a certain extent, royals are also free to marry whom they choose. Given all of these facts, it was unlikely that she would be born to be anything lower than above average. She obtained one last thing that she would not have been able to achieve on her own. This was the spirit of a spiritualist in this world. There were originally two types of people. Those who are able to use their physical form to the utmost capacity, and those who have a spirit allowing them to manipulate the power within them. Though as Karam was now, she had little to no awareness of such things. Instead, her memories of her last moments were clear within her mind. Since for her it was the most recent thing that had happened to her. She had no way of knowing what had happened after she died, because her soul was no longer connected to a body. Therefore there was no way to record memories. The memories of her birth were blurry. Especially for her. This was because she was in shock over the gory end she had been brought to. She was still attempting to comprehend the situation she had been in and therefore thought less about the situation she was in than. From what she can remember, she couldn't breathe. A sensation that she couldn't explain ran itself over her, and as it peeled away she felt numerous pains like he had never before experienced. Hours passed and she slowly came out of shock. The sounds and actions she could make were unpracticed and rough. Again shock overcame her and she began to cry again. After she realized what had happened, she changed. Ishi Ayono, now known as Karam Hawking, had fallen into depression. This was not a possibility for babies, but somehow Karam's mind had already formed far beyond his years. The royal physician finally came to the same conclusion. Majesty, this is not an illness I can cure. The thin man bowed sorrowfully. His long hair fell over his shoulders and his robes shifted as he did so. The man he spoke to looked like he had just reached adulthood, yet a scorn had already been made his main expression. The man's expression darkened, then call on another. He turned as if the decision had been done and the situation situated. Sire. The physician lifted his head, but didn't make a move to leave. He paused in his step and yelled, I said call on another. It is not something any spirit is able to cure. It is a sickness of the mind. The reason she hasn't cried is because she has not the will to live on. I have never seen one so young infected by. What do you mean no will? The man turned and was lifting the physician into the air within a second. She doesn't even think for herself yet. The thin man struggled in his grasp as the few servants in the room shuffled their feet uncomfortably. Prince Jasna. Strangling the throats of the spiritualists will not change the facts. A woman stepped forward from her spot at his side. She didn't dare raise her hand against him, though she was sure she could win if it came to it. But she feared it would only make him wilder. Her voice was calm. Rena, you may be my wife, but think again if you believe you have control over me. Jasna, she snapped softly at him. She is my child just as she is yours. Do you think I feel nothing? I also feel anger. But bringing pain to the one who understands is not going to help her. Princess Rena held herself together like a princess should. She was composed even as her shoulders sagged under sadness. Prince Jasna looked over his shoulder. He also saw sadness in her eyes. It was the first time to be so close to someone. It was the first time that someone truly understood his pain as he did. The prince opened his arm and allowed the thin man to drop. Prince Jasna turned and left the room, leaving behind him a wind that circled around and quickly scattered. Princess Rena silently sighed at her husband's childish behavior. "Are you all right?" She bent down and helped the man up easily with one hand. "Why, yes, thank you, Your Majesty," she shook her head. "You mustn't call us by such names." Titles like this were reserved for the rulers of the land. As the king was still alive, it was rude to call others by such a thing. She looked towards her child. What could we have done to have made her lose her will to live? At such a young age, she didn't continue. Everyone in the room understood what she was saying. The physician also looked towards the unmoving child. "That is what I cannot figure out. There is no sickness. Therefore it is in the mind, and yet it is unprecedented in such a young being. It has never been seen before. It has never been done before," the man explained. "To give up requires a certain level of awareness that hasn't been seen in children until they are able to learn techniques. Even if I were to fix her mind, she would only fall back into this state. There is no reason that she should have such strong chemicals taking over her mind." It's the man shrugged. Princess Reva nodded, her eyes watching the weak old child in her crib. The physician bowed, excusing himself, and left the room. After he had left, Rena walked over to the crib and stroked her child's cheek. "Is this calmer, I wonder?" she chuckled slightly. "If so, then how fitting of you to be called Karam." Princess Rena stood and left the room. The three servants who had taken on the job of caring for the child looked at each other. "Do you think the princess named her that on purpose?" One of the girls played with her long braid as she thought. "I heard it was the princess's mother that named her. I heard it was the king. Maybe the king did something to her then." The three girls looked over at the white bed. One of the girls laughed nervously. "No way. We've been with her almost the whole time anyway. That spiritualist said she should be too young for such things." The girl with short brown hair shook her head. No matter their excuse, doubt blossomed within them. "Do you think the girls picked at her long hair again?" Yazine, before the red-haired girl could finish, her elder sister cut her off. "Speaking ill of the king is treason. I won't stand for it, but elder sister Sabine, I know. I don't care what you say, I will not hear it. Now go play with the young princess." The girl expelled air and pulled up her shoulders. It had been her habit even as a child to stand with great posture. Even more so when she was feeling upset. She walked away looking nothing less than a queen, as she muttered to herself. Playing with a child that shows no interest is just plain. Sabine sighed and turned to the third girl. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Bracken." The girl, who hadn't said a word yet, simply shook her head. She smiled at the elder sister. Bracken was a girl who was gentle and, in her own way, beautiful. Though such figures weren't favored in this world. She had a curvaceous figure and a sensual face. On earth she could easily strike the hearts of many men. Though her hips and breasts were seen as nuisances, and were looked upon poorly. Because of this, Bracken had been given many troubles in her life. Her face made women jealous, even though her figure only meant that she would not be able to be proficient in fighting. Due to this, she had been endlessly teased. Eventually, she had stopped talking and made a living by helping others. Specifically those whom she didn't have to speak to. Meaning she was most comfortable around babies. Because of this, she had put all her heart into caring for them, who don't say any harsh things. And she eventually made her way into the new kingdom's caretakers. The sisters, on the other hand, had used many dirty tricks to fight their way up and stay together. The two sisters also didn't fit into the society like most did. The elder sister Sabine had never had an interest in males. Instead, her eyes had always been drawn to other females. Because of this, she was labeled a freak and had been teased by those who knew her secret to the point of being kicked out from her teachings. The younger sister was the elder sister's only support. She was the only one who wasn't biased against her preferences. Because of this, they have become each other's strength. One of the only ways they could think of to stay together was get a job in the New Kingdom. Of course, just being together wasn't the only reason they had chosen this job. Sabine blushed as Bracken smiled. Haha. Sabine cleared her throat and changed the subject. Well, the princess sure is pretty, isn't she? She's only just had a child, and yet she seems like she's still in tip-top shape. Bracken paused after a moment. She smiled again and nodded. Seeing Bracken's response spurred her on. I had heard many horrible rumors about her, but after seeing her, it doesn't seem to be true. I think the two really do love each other. Bracken cocked her head, insinuating that she didn't understand. Because the New Kingdom was made possible because of their strong love for each other. But there have been rumors about them not loving each other, and that the princess had some spirit in her, and that she would bring ruin on the old kingdom, and Sabine babbled, trying to explain what Bracken didn't understand. Anyways, I'm going to go make some milk for the young princess. New Kingdom was made possible because the prince and princess's love had brought them together, and they had overcome their differences to be together. This had brought the idea that the two can overcome anything, and the people are in a state of joy, believing that if the two young lovers can overcome the war of the two kingdoms, that they can overcome anything that is thrown their way. Therefore, they are a sign of hope to their people. As Sabine left for the kitchens, Bracken sat down next to Yazine, who was holding Princess Karam and dangling a toy in front of her face. You think the rumor about the princess poisoning her mother is true? I mean, she did die just before the two married. It seems to be a little bit too coincidental. Yazine sighed and handed over the child. Then she fell onto her back. Her short dress had worked itself higher when she had sat on the floor with Karam, and even higher when she stretched out her legs as she fell back. Yet she didn't even seem to notice. But they didn't seem very in love. I mean, can anyone get into the heart of that cold prince? Bracken tapped Yazine's leg and pointed to the baby in her arms. Why? He did seem pissed when he was told there was nothing he could do. But wasn't that just his hate for the spiritualists? After all, ever since the New Kingdom, they haven't been slaves anymore. She paused. Yazine's blue eyes stared at the ceiling. It used to be that all Sharis had their own to make that former pills and stuff to up their strength. But when they got married, the princess changed that. Maybe it was just pent-up anger. Bracken looked at the emotionless child in her arms. Was it really like that? Was the young princess hated? No. Bracken loved the girl with all her heart. It would seem that the two sisters also cared for her. The two sat in silence, pondering about things until Sabine returned. Yazine, how unsightly! Keep those legs shut. Only Bryn are allowed to wear pants, and you couldn't even make Mao. So change your actions to fit. She sat down on the rug next to Bracken and touched a crude bottle to Karam's lips. Yazine popped up. Well, I blame you for that. Despite her horrible words, she knelt and returned to proper sitting position. If it weren't for you letting everybody find out you liked G. Yazine, Sabine yelled at her sister. It's just Bracken. She's bound to find out sooner or later. After seeing her sister's dark expression, she gave in. All right, I won't say a word. I won't say anything until I find out her thoughts about it. Yazine smiled and jumped up, narrowly avoiding her sister's attack. She laughed as she left the room. We don't need 3 for 1. I'm napping. Sabine didn't want Bracken to find out she fancied her. After all, she had been hated for that very thing before. Days passed and Karam showed no signs of improvement. 2 weeks after she was born, Karam suddenly began refusing food. Unguarded life. Princess, you must eat, otherwise your death will be on our shoulders. Yazin. That is a little extreme, don't you think? Sabine knelt down next to her sister and handed her another bottle. This is the 3rd one we've tried. It's not the temperature. The younger sister pushed away the bottle. She hasn't eaten all day. Yazin looked down at Karam with sad eyes. Even though she was simply going along with her sister, she had grown a little attached to the girl, as she had worked here. Sabine sighed. Bracken will be back with a spiritualist any second that can help. A few minutes later Bracken opened the door, and a large man entered. He was thin for a former, but to built for many spiritualist also. He was probably only about the prince's age. Oh, I'm sorry, she was supposed to get a spiritualist. Sabine stood to apologize to the stranger, but he ignored her and knelt in front of Yazin. Instead, what's wrong? He gently lifted the child from her embrace and began checking the child. She hasn't eaten. Wait just a moment. You can't just. Sabine tried to take back the princess. The stranger grabbed her hands in a flash in his one hand that wasn't holding the child. This girl is nicknamed the new hope of those from both the old kingdoms. Do you know what would happen if this girl died? Sabine tried pulling her hands free as he spoke. I let depression. Everyone would fall into depression. Rumors would spread about foul play, and the 2 kingdoms would eventually turn against each other, and war would break out. Of course, this new castle, being stuck right in between the 2 territories, would quickly turn to ashes, as the family turned against each other. It would be a war worse than the last, with casualties beyond anything known in our history. Do you want to be responsible for that? Sabine had stopped struggling, and was looking at him slightly frightened. She shook her head, then shut up. He let go and turned his attention back to the princess. Sabine sat quietly. Karam, having understood some of what the stranger had said, had on a troubled expression. It seemed she was making trouble for those around her. Even so, she refused to drink that horrible, boring liquid again. It made her sick just thinking about it. Is she going to be okay? Yazin stared at the princess, with worry written all over her face. I don't know. You haven't actually told me what is wrong with her. He glared at the younger sister. It must have been pretty bad for that girl to drag me all the way here. Yet she doesn't seem to be in any danger. She refuses to eat. Yazin gave him the bottle she was holding. He took it, setting the princess down in his lap. He dropped a bit of the liquid on his wrist. Then he tasted it. How long has she not eaten? I was with her all night, but I just thought she wasn't hungry. When Sabine showed up, she all right? I understand the situation. He turned to Sabine, who had been sitting properly next to him with her head hanging. Good. Go grab as many fruits as you can and anything soft or that has little flavor. And grab anything purple or black that you can find. She hesitated. Hurry. Sabine jumped up and ran out of the room. What's wrong with her? Yazin stared at the princess with worried eyes. Nothing. What? She looked up at the stranger in surprise. Karam is simply being picky. She's a princess. It can't be helped. He put his hands behind his head and leaned against the crib casually. But sure, I know. It usually happens when they are older and not by choice. The man laughed. To think she's this far ahead from her peers. I wonder how she will turn out in the future. The girl stared at him, then looked to the princess. How indeed. Sabine arrived out of breath, with a large basket of fruits and other things. I bruff or she panted as she spoke. After being kicked out of the academy, she hadn't done much in the way of training. In fact, she had done so little that she could no longer be called a former. A former is one who uses their body or form to the utmost capacity. Although most don't train to such an extent, it's rare to see someone without a spirit so lacking in fitness. What are you, a Mao? And yet you're caring for the princess. What happens if someone opposed to the new kingdom comes to end her life? Could you three even fight off a spiritualist? Spiritualists are known for their knowledge and ability to refine abilities in order to give a boost to those who swallow the refined form. Because spiritualists actively seek out knowledge rather than physical prowess, it isn't uncommon for them to faint or show other signs of poor physical prowess. For a former, it was considered a derogatory term when comparing physically. We are going to have to change that. Bring me the basket. Okay, now go get the father. I am going to have a talk with him. While it was shocking for someone to speak about the prince in such ways, the stranger seemed to understand who the child was. Because of this, Sabine only paused a moment before nodding and turning back. Yazin began to rise, but was pulled back down by the stranger. No, I have already begun her training instead. Go get her some water for her to drink when she gets back. Yazin nodded and walked to the kitchen where, here it is. The stranger pulled an avocado from the basket. Here you go, princess, try this. The stranger skillfully pulled it open, revealing white meat surrounding a pit. He scooped up some of the meat with the back of his fingernail and touched the baby's lips. It was common knowledge that one had to bounce the bottle's tip against a child's lips to get them to open up and drink. Karam, who had been refusing the milk due to the taste, assessed the man. The man wasn't probably even 20 yet, but had a good build and great face. Though he seemed stern, his actions provided a casual air that she was drawn to. Karam opened her mouth and tried the avocado. Bracken sucked in a breath. The stranger smiled and offered her some more. Karam watched the stranger's eyes as she ate the fruit, enjoying the taste more than she had expected. The stranger's eyes were grey. It was something that anyone might become entranced about. After a while, the stranger held the fruit directly to her mouth. The young princess didn't have any teeth yet, so she was unable to eat it correctly. Even so, she grabbed the fruit and tilted it, trying to get even one more lick of the sweet fruit. But she only ended up hurting her gums. She whined and pushed it away. She was unable to do anything but suck on it at this point. She pushed it back into the stranger's hands, letting him know exactly what she wanted. What? He feigned ignorance. What do you want? I don't understand. Just then, the door opened up once again, and the prince stoled in. He glared at the stranger, whom had made himself comfortable in his daughter's room. What are you doing here? Just a second. The stranger didn't look away from the young princess as the prince entered the room. I don't understand what you want from me. You have to say it. His eyebrows rose as a cruel smile spread itself on his lips. The princess whined again. Until now, whining and reaching had been enough for the people around her to obey. She hadn't yet come across such an adversary. She grabbed at the avocado. Oh, you want this back? He began to put it back into her hands. The young princess whined again and pushed back. Hui, what? The stranger cupped his ear. Hu-ish, oh. Understanding fell over his face. Please. He smiled and nodded his head. Karam felt relieved. It was the most work she had done since crying at Yazin a few days ago. Please, what? Disappointment rushed over her as the stranger turned back to her with a blank expression. She whined again, but knew she was not going to get anywhere with tears in front of this man. It was also true that Karam was quite hungry after refusing the disgusting drink all night. Or ish or oh more of this. He held up the avocado. Karam nodded "oh." He paused before quickly agreeing okay. He scooped up some more just as he had before and touched her bottom lip again. Karam grabbed his finger and maneuvered it into her mouth, where she could easily put the entirety of the avocado piece in her mouth without trouble. As you can see, Jasna, your daughter is quite the genius. Most children her age would barely be learning to open their eyes. Karam almost rolled her eyes. So that's why my eyes have felt so dry and painful lately. The others, who had been staring in shock, came back to their senses as the stranger spoke to them. Yazin had also arrived and almost dropped the cup she had prepared for her sister. From now on, you shouldn't treat her like a normal child and take this into account as you nurture her. Otherwise, he looked up at Sabine. Sabine froze as if she had suddenly been encased in ice. Prince Jasna, on the other hand, glared at him. I'm appointing you a new job, caretaker. Jasna left the room. Jas, hold on, I have training. The stranger cursed, but didn't go after him. Karam, who had been eating the soft avocado meat, smiled at him. He looked down at her. What are you looking at? Karam laughed and tried to smirk. Ug. The great warrior was thoroughly annoyed. Like father, like daughter. Not only was the prince's orders absolute, he had also been laughed at by a child. He sighed and picked up a mango from the basket. He smoothly broke off a piece and shoved it between the smiling lips. Just you wait, your time is coming. I will have you running around in no time begging to do me favors. He sneered at the baby and pushed the piece around just to tease her. After he had had his fill, he removed the piece and ate it in one bite. Dog breath, go get me a plate and knife, big plate. He looked at Sabine, who was now gulping down water like her life depended on it. You ginger, go get books, but we already have school books for teaching children to read and write, and you. He turned to Bracken and paused. Go make the four of us breakfast. The girls hurried off, leaving the princess in the hands of the strange, rude man. Gourmet life. As they were leaving, he picked up Karam and stood up. He looked around the room before he found where the blankets are and pulled a few free. He spread a few out on top of one another and laid Karam to the side of them. Then he laid next to her on his side, his arm propping his head up. He grabbed a stuffed animal and made it dance on Karam's stomach as he talked to her. So just how smart are you? Can you read and write? Well, I guess that one is probably impossible. Even for you. Karam shook her head. He seemed to take it as baby movements as he continued. Do you understand me? You seem to understand what I was saying earlier. Or was that just trained or coincidence? He stopped his barrage of questions and the dancing horse stopped moving. If you can understand what I'm saying, raise your right hand. Karam reached over and raised the horse's right hoof. If you can understand me, roll over. He commanded her as if she were a dog begging for treats. Karam glared at the man. After a second, Karam took the horse and threw it at him. The horse fell to the floor beside her due to poor control. But he understood her intentions. He laughed. All right. All right, I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure. So, is the future queen really as bad as they say? The stranger leaned forward a few inches and lowered his voice. Karam thought back to one of the times her and her mother had been left alone together. Her mother was a young woman of about 15 years old. She had short, thin hair that didn't suit her pretty face. Her attitude didn't match her cute appearance. But once the door shut behind the three caretakers, she changed. It was amazing the things people spew when they think you can't understand. Hiya Kara, a smile had lit up her mother's face. She looked at her daughter as if she were the most precious thing on this planet. I'm your mom, although you probably don't understand. She laughed gently. I'm going to tell you a story. Karam had wrapped her hand around Rena's finger, and Ida now moved it back and forth, playing with Karam as she spoke. It's about a loyal girl and an unwilling boy. The two were part of feuding families. One family believed that spiritualists were made to sustain the formed, and saw them as little more than tools. The other believed that, while it would be nice to help the formed, the spiritualists should still be able to retain their free will. The girl had just lost her only relative. While the girl was overcome with grief, the boy's father came to the girl in secret. The man wanted to end the feud and offered her away. If she and the boy played lovers, it would bring hope to his family. This man was a truly righteous soul, even if it meant being hated. He wished for the happiness of his family. His idea was this: his son and the girl would pretend to be lovers. They would show to the families that they could overcome anything. It would lead the families to believe that if they could overcome hate, then the misery of the families would soon pass. Because if they succeeded, they would become the leaders of the family. Therefore, if their new leaders could overcome anything, then the people, families, would be able to. She looked down at me. Does this make sense? I've always been better at fighting than anything else. I'm just glad that I have you here, in this land of uncertainties. Karam remembered this memory and looked up at the stranger. Norbidu, what, not bad did you say? Karam nodded. Well, I suppose I'll have to believe you for now. He paused and looked away for a moment. All right. If you can say so with certainty, then I will treat her like a true princess. Karam nodded hard, moving her whole body in the process. Heads really were too big on babies. The stranger nodded as well. All right. Karam changed the subject by pointing to him. Normi nor on me. Oh, my name is Dolph. Do you know how formers are split up yet? Karam shook her head again. Uamara. You don't know what a former is either. All right. In that case, let me tell you a story. Our world began as rock and air. Within the two was a power at its purest form. Eventually, the two powers began to mold themselves into a higher power. The rock stood up and began to walk, while the air began to think. The air became what he knew as spirit, and the earth became a form. Eventually, the air grew jealous of the forms. The spirit wanted to feel and move. So the spirit made a conscious of little power and gave it to the first form. Then, the first spirit took the second form and spoke to the first. The spirit and the form made a deal. If the spirit gave all the forms consciences, then the form would make a lesser form for the spirits. After many years, the forms had left to the other side of the rock to create more greater beings. The spirits stayed to gain knowledge and further themselves. Eventually, the spirits began to gain powers that differed from one another. They began to fight one another. The forms, who had traveled all around the rock and back, saw a war between the spirits. The forms tried to stop them from fighting, but instead were dragged into it. Some of the spirits begged for protection. Some of them demanded it. And others made a deal with the formers that would benefit both parties. This is the story of how our world began. Our two kingdoms were once one tribe from a former and a spiritualist who had made a deal. Eventually, our views of the spiritualists changed and we became separated. This is why it was such a big war that drove us apart. If we fight, it is as if we are rejecting our ancestors. He sighed and his casual atmosphere returned. Well, it's just a story. And nobody really knows what kind of deal the original former and spiritualist made. So there's no right or wrong here, at least. That's what I think, of course. Our prince and princess have different view of it. The two were quiet for a while before Karam rolled over and hit Dolph. P2 her oh right. Formers are split mostly into three. The first hoop to jump is Mal. This is usually around 14. At this point one should be able to face a wild animal. Above that one in Bryn. Most people don't get this high even within their whole life. Only those with proper teaching will get to this stage before they are 40. To get to Mal is almost guaranteed for anyone. But after that you are all on your own. Above Bryn is Shari. All royals are at least this level if they want to marry into the family. Above that is a rare positions that most people don't even know about. It's called Dione Olf Bain No. I'm a special case. I had talent when I was young. On top of that, I was taken in by a Shari, so I was a Bryn by the time most others my age were Mal. Now I work for the king training his special force. Karam was confused if he worked for the king. Then why did her father appoint him as caretaker? He was a fighter, not a nurse also. Wasn't it up to the king to decide what Dolph did instead of his son? Karam was trying to think up a subject she could change to when Dolph did it for her. Would you stop eavesdropping already? Start cutting up fruit for the baby. The door opened to reveal Bracken Yazin and Sabine, who had been listening in on the conversation. I've never heard of a Dione before. Are you a Shin? You're a Shin, right? Most people haven't now cut fruit. He ignored Yazin altogether, who was jumping up and down and begging him to teach her. Only cut a little bit of each of them off and up to them on the plate. Then give me the knife and bring the plate over here. Dolph sat up and accepted the plate Bracken was holding for him. Thanks. Oi, Ginger, put the books away and eat. I'm going to be training all of you, so there's no need to get fussy. What? No way am I going to accept lessons from someone like you. Sabine paused while she was cutting up an apple. Don't bother with that one. She doesn't have teeth yet. Sabine looked down and began grumbling to herself. Ginger, you took night shift right after you eat. Go get some sleep. Your training begins after lunch. Don't be late, you the talky one. Are you a Mal yet? He looked at Bracken. Bracken snapped her head up. She looked at him slightly frightened. She began fiddling with her hands. She didn't answer. Don't make fun of her, Sabine butted in again. But was ignored. Well, I'll find out eventually. Ginger, what about you? We dropped out before 5th. Yazin motioned to her sister. You two related? Don't tell him anything. Yes, Yazin beamed. She's my elder sister, Sabine. I'm Yazin. It's rare for anyone to drop. Oh, Sabine froze. It's complicated. Yazin kept her promise and avoided the question. Big sister, you done yet with those fruit? Don't call me that. Sabine stood up and handed him the plate. All right. Let's dig in. The girls noticed that he had waited until everyone had their food before eating. Princess, what one do you want to try next? While waiting for Karen to decide, he nibbled on his own food. When she decided, he put his aside and cut a few small bites for her. Karam picked a pink fruit she hadn't seen before. Dolph peeled off the red, hard skin and cut into the soft, lighter tones meat inside. He touched it to her lips again. Karam opened her mouth, but barely touched it before wincing and pulling away. The fruit that looked sweet like candy at first was sour like an unripe pineapple. Dolph laughed at her reaction. This one is called buid and is usually used in cooking. It works great if used as a tenderizer for meat. After no more than half an hour with Dolph, Karam had figured out a little bit about the boy. He wasn't one to brag. If anything, he would rather hide his strengths and blend into the crowd. He had a habit of humming which he probably wasn't even aware of. He was probably an orphan when he was younger. Despite looking like a foolish crass male, he was actually quite intelligent and had a high stature in society. He was used to being in charge, his caring character. though he hides it behind rude words, is clear to those around him and leaves people with a sense of happiness. He looks up to the shin that took him in also. He didn't like his eye color. Dolph also recognizes those worthy of his recognition, and knows exactly where he sits in hierarchy and doesn't reach. All in all, he was the kind of guy any girl would kill for. Because even though he was modest and kind with a hard exterior, he was hot and had influence even at his young age. Karam smiled and laughed as she picked up a mango-looking fruit. If it was him, then she wouldn't mind being taught about the world by him. He did seem to understand her better than anyone else so far. Of course, he seems to have gone through a similar experience when he was younger and got rejected by his peers. Karam figured this was the reason he was so modest. Dolph was probably not only a shin, but either a high-ranking shin or a Dione. Karam was now sitting up to give her a better view of her choices. In the past hour she had done more than she had in 2 weeks, and her little body was quickly running out of fuel. Nonetheless, she had to intention to give into the desire to refuel. Because just as she had tired herself out, she was also excited for the first time since coming to this planet. Karam held up the mango to Dolph. All right. He took it with a smile and began to teach her about this one. This one grows on a tree. They have a few of them on the palace grounds. It's called a hondo and it's a summer fruit. He passed her a small bite. Karam tried it to find it was exactly like the one she knew from Earth. She shook her head. Nuo dish ango, what ango mmm. Ango. Karam scolded him for getting it wrong so far. He had understood her easily and didn't talk down to her. For Karam, who had felt inferior for the past 2 weeks to the point of depression, this was a huge step forward. Mango yesh dish. She took the next bite he had readied for her and held it up for him. The mango was stringy and a little hard to eat, but it reminded her of home and made her feel nostalgic. She turned back to the plate, hoping for more similar tastes, and began to get more bold in her choices. She tried a green, gooey fruit and one that looked like a lime as well. Breakfast ended without consequence, satisfied life. After breakfast, Dolph sent Bracken and Sabine to run around the castle a few times while he brought out the books for Karam. Karam had always been good at studying. In her last life, she preferred research over textbooks because her focus never stayed on one thing for very long. But Karam had been curious about the language. It sounds a lot like English, which made it easy for her to understand, learn, and pick up as she knew it as Ishi Ayono. But she hadn't yet seen the written language. He opened the book to reveal an entirely new language altogether. Of all the languages on Earth that she could recognize, this wasn't any of them. He skipped over a number of pages before it began looking like a kindergarten textbook. Do you recognize any of these? Dolph was laying on his stomach, propping himself up with his arms while Karam laid between his chest and the floor under him. Being as they were, it wasn't weird, and neither of them converted it into anything dirty. Karam shook her head. No, okay. This page eyes to match the sounds to the animal who makes them. Here's a pencil. She took the pencil, but didn't do the activity. Karam pointed to the first few characters. Disu. It says raw. Karam wrote next to it in Romaji what she heard. Disu. It says go again. She translated it into English to make her understanding easier. They continued like that down the page. Then she began comparing the writing in the book to the sounds. So this part of this kanji that looks like a Romaji, lowercase t, makes the sound R, while the part that looks like mountain in Japanese sounds like O. That means they read it this way. But what's with this character? Dolph watched as she worked. She was using signs and creating a key for their language. Essentially, she was translating. though Dolph was confused as to what signs she was using and what they meant to her. Whatever it was, she was gaining understand and asked him questions about how one sound has a different effect on another. Karam flew through the pages faster and faster as she went until she finally felt she had a basic understanding of the language. In the end, it wasn't too different than English, except they created a character out of the sounds of the word. The young princess sighed and pulled out a blank piece of paper. In sloppy, unpracticed penmanship, she explained to Dolph that there was a mix-up. "My name is EP1. I come from another planet. Does Dolph know how I got here?" Dolph read it out loud after she handed it to him. "Another planet? Never heard of something like that. Do you want to go back?" Dolph looked down at Karam seriously. Karam thought about it. She took the paper and wrote again, "Dead O." He read over her head as she wrote, "So, do you wish to live as Aishi Arno or Karam Hocking? No matter what, I am still me. What people call me will not change that. Oh." Very mature. Karam hit his arm. "I was twice your age." "So what? That makes you 43. Karam paused. "A woman never reveals her true age. Where I come from, it's rude to ask." Dolph med. "Wait." Karam turned to him slightly annoyed. "Nothing. I was just thinking. I don't know how to act around you if that's true." Dolph avoided eye contact. Karam watched him for a while before turning back to her paper. It might sound like a line, or it might be weird in other ways, but she decided she wasn't about to hold back just because her appearance had changed. She had always been a very affectionate person. "Don't change." She turned back and held it up for him. Dolph glanced at it and laughed. "All right, I'll do so. After all, who am I to turn down a princess's request?" Karam thought that as a Dione he might be able to, but she knew that he didn't like his true abilities being known to others. Bringing it up might drive them apart. So Karam put the thought aside and laughed along with him. After they were done laughing, they looked at each other. An understanding that she hadn't known before shone within their eyes as they watched each other. After a moment, they began laughing again. Dolph took a deep breath. His spirit regained and turned back to the book. "Okay, what's next?" During lunch, the princess arrived. She opened the door to a room of laughter. Sabine was on the floor, collapsed. Since her workout ended and Bracken was happily clearing away empty plates. What she didn't expect was a man in the room who held her daughter in his lap. Dolph was sitting crisscross, with the young princess laying on his legs, while he reclined with his hands above his head. He was laughing with Karam, who hadn't looked so happy in for as long as the princess had known her. As she entered, 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Dolph was the first to speak. "Are the future queen?" He picked up Karam and stood to bow politely. He smiled. "Have you came to play with your daughter?" Rena observed him closely, but could find no ill will within his actions. "I did not know we hired a new caretaker." "Well, don't be alarmed. The prince assigned me to the post early this morning. Bracken went to fetch a spiritualist because the young princess wasn't eating, and seemed to have mistaken me for one." He smiled gently and bowed again, being careful not to harm. "Karam wasn't eating. I have explained it to you, husband." He paused. "But your daughter is quite the special child. Her tastes are far ahead of those of her peers, and her intelligence is extraordinary for one her age. I must say she is worthy of being called this kingdom's hope." As he spoke, he motioned to some fruit and the books the two had worked on earlier, which were still spread out on the ground. Princess Rena glanced at the writing and, "Your credentials that allow you to touch me, daughter." "I have favor with the king." Karam shook her head. "That's certainly putting it lightly." Karam stepped in to save him. "Oma." She held out her hands towards the princess. It worked just as Karam had hoped. Surprise flashed over her face and she rushed over to take her child. What was that? Rena looked like she was on the brink of tears as she smiled down at Karam. Karam thought that it was so near lunch that Rena might not even have eaten before she rushed over here. Therefore, her plan was to use her new knowledge to both bring up her spirits and fill her belly. Honestly, Karam was a little uneasy about having a mother younger than her. But if it was something like this, then she didn't mind. It was like caring for a child who thought they were the ones caring for you. Dolph quietly picked up Sabine and left with Bracken. Karam smiled at him before he left, thanking him. He nodded in understanding and smiled back before shutting the door behind him. After spending some time with her mother, Karam began to drift off. She had taken a nap earlier with Dolph, but her little body was meant to sleep for most of the day. Karam yawned, showing Rena what she was after, and accepted the help she offered into her crib. For the second time that day, Karam drifted off feeling fulfilled with her life. Dione life. The young Princess Karam's life continued in a similar fashion for 4 years. In that time, she had learned to use her mouth and fine motor skills. She had also begun lessons from Dolph on hand-to-hand combat. Though her contact with anyone other than her parents and her caretakers was minimal. On her 4th birthday, her father and mother entered the room together. Karam rarely saw them together. Though she had heard of sweet nothings they say to each other, she hadn't seen it herself. It was obvious that it was only an act put on in public. Karam. Her father loomed over her as she sat in Dolph's lap. You are going to attend an academy from now on. You will go by a new name and act as if you are the child of a noble as you attend. You may choose one caretaker to attend to you, in this time a female caretaker. Father glared at Dolph and eyed the position the two sat in. How long? Karam turned upside down and crossed her legs on Dolph's chest as her head hung next to his crossed feet. Until you graduate. Karam looked to Dolph for an explanation. Each student works along one another and are often of the same level. Though there are no restrictions to how fast one may learn and excel. The fastest recorded through a 5 to 7 school is just under 1 year. Her father cleared his throat. You are not going to a 5 to 7, but instead a 7 to 10 school. Even though I'm barely 4, you are a genius. There is nothing to be done about it also. Dolph has informed me that you have nearly accomplished your 3rd. Congratulations. Karam looked back up at Dolph. To become a Mao, there are 7 things you must master. A certain degree of knowledge, control, and fearlessness are all required. You have passed the first 2 levels knowledge and have shown basic control. Though you have already mastered the 4th and 5th, which include technique. They are useless without the 3rd, control. Control is considered one of the most difficult stages to master. Dolph turned his attention to Jasna. What school will she be attending, Bree? He replied coldly. Then, will the caretaker double as her bodyguard? It's a school known for nobles, so it's targeted often. Jasna cleared his throat and furrowed his brow. I was going to have Mishi go as her guard. A low-shin Dolph looked at him with raised eyebrows. Jazz, you know how tough a place like that is. It's no place for a princess to walk into unguarded. That's why I was allowing her to take one of the kingdom's highest-ranked soldiers. His haughty attitude left little room for compromise. Karam's father always seemed to hold some sort of grudge to Dolph. He was unlikely to accept Dolph going with Karam. There was something that bothered the little princess. If one's level decided their level of influence in the society, then why wasn't Dolph anything more than a mere soldier? Because Dione are so rare that people don't even know about them. There was a high chance that Dolph was one of the only ones in the castle. So why hasn't he been crowned the next king? If it had something to do with father, Then father was probably jealous of Dolph's abilities, and somehow hacked his chances of rising any higher. Father had probably done it in his youth and was regretting it. Though being the proud prince that he is, he would rather have Dolph think that he still hated him rather than bending his knee to apologize. Karam wanted to laugh at him and tell him that Dolph wouldn't have stayed so long if he still hated you. But there were other possibilities. It could be that father had nothing to do with Dolph's position. In fact, he might not even know about it. His reactions might just be because he felt Dolph was taking his daughter away from him. It was also entirely possible that father was simply jealous and felt no guilt. Whatever the reason, Karam could see that Dolph didn't hold it against him. If anything, he pushed blame onto himself. Well, if that is what the crown prince so says, then that is how it shall be. Dolph put up his hands and shrugged in defeat. Prince Jasna grunted his agreement and left the room, leaving an air of wind, as he always did when storming off. Princess Rena sighed as she watched her husband leave. Kara dear, you are free to take with you whomever you please. She bent down to talk to the young princess. Your father is childish, but if you decide so, he won't go against it, I know. Ma, thanks, but I will listen to him. If he decides his pride rules over my protection, then I will allow him to make those decisions. I can only hope that he will eventually realize his mistake. After all, she shrugged and shook her head. We all know Dolph is the best farmer in the castle. If there is anyone with the ability to protect me, his outshines anyone else's by miles. Although I paused, I haven't met grandfather yet, so I could be wrong. The only reason she had touched on his pride was because Karam knew that her father would be listening just outside the door. After Karam finished talking, everyone was quiet. Just when she was beginning to wonder if she had said something wrong, Dolph began to laugh. He bent backwards and held his stomach. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the fantastical world of Karam. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to embark on your adventure, and hit the notification bell so you can be the first to know about the next chapter of Karam's story.